Let's go check now the top business news stories. Yuka Roya from the Business Desk joins me now. Welcome back to you, Yuka. Let's begin in Afghanistan. Cash supplies really dwindling, aren't they?
That's right. Well, the World Bank today has become the latest international organisation to freeze funding for Afghanistan, citing concern over the impact of the Taliban takeover on the country's development prospects, especially for women. The move comes as Western governments and lenders have been trying to maintain pressure on the insurgents, while at the same time negotiate a safe exit for people wanting to leave, as well as protection for Afghan civilians who are left in a dire situation. Yenna Lee reports.
Banks are still closed in Kabul and patience is wearing thin. Financial institutions are at a standstill despite the Taliban urging mid-level officials to return to work.
This month's salary was not given. People are faced with financial problems and they can't afford to get food or pay their rent.
As citizens struggle to find cash, prices for basic goods such as rice, flour and gas continue to rise. Monday, the Taliban named an acting head for Afghanistan's central bank in a bid to bring stability to the country. But the insurgents are largely shunned by the international community, the very people and institutions that have kept the previous Afghan government afloat. Indeed, 70 to 80% of their budget came from foreign donors. Since the insurgents' takeover, the IMF denied Afghanistan access to its loans. The EU pulled development funds. Washington froze the Afghan central bank's $9 billion cash reserves, which are kept in the US. Now the World Bank has suspended its projects. The lender had spent $5.3 billion there since 2002.
As long as the Taliban are a terrorist group, we have leverage. Because they can't access their assets except in an illicit way. They can't access financial assistance. They can't access loans.
As the international community puts financial pressure on the Taliban, Afghan civilians find themselves stuck between a cash squeeze and a humanitarian crisis.
Well, Afghanistan's economy grew rapidly after the Taliban were toppled 20 years ago. GDP increased by about 9% every year until 2012, driven by public spending and agriculture. Since then, growth has slowed down amid political instability, deteriorating security and rising unemployment. Now, according to the World Bank, foreign aid accounted for 100% of the country's GDP back in 2009. That share has gradually declined as Western troops drew down, but it's still made up more than 40% of GDP before the Taliban takeover. US President Joe Biden has asked the bosses of Apple, Google and Amazon and other business leaders to do more to protect America from cyber attacks. At a meeting at the White House, the president said the government and the private sector must work together to respond to the growing threat. In the past few months alone, a series of high-profile attacks targeting network manager SolarWinds, the Colonial Pipeline and others by suspected Russian and Chinese hackers have crippled vital infrastructure and affected thousands of companies. Earlier this year, Biden pressed Russian President Vladimir Putin to hold people responsible for recent ransomware attacks to account. Meanwhile, French business leaders and senior politicians are gathering for the annual conference of the Employers' Federation, MEDEF. They're meeting at a time when the French economy is bouncing back strongly from the COVID-19 recession, with GDP expected to return to pre-pandemic levels by the end of this year. In fact, many sectors are now experiencing a shortage of workers, which could hamper the recovery. The head of the business lobby spoke to France 24 about his concerns.
A year ago, everybody was pessimistic. There was a lot of bad figure coming. We are talking about a wall of bankruptcy. We're talking about 1 million more people seeking jobs. In fact, it didn't happen. So we've got good figure, but I'm also cautious. Why? Because we have difficulties. The first one is recruitment. We see also a lot of difficulties in sourcing. The price of certain raw materials increased massively, so that can create difficulty. And overall, the international situation.
Well, the Medef president was speaking to our business editor, Stephen Carroll, who's at the conference. He reports now on what the French finance minister, Bruno Le Maire, had to tell business leaders after 18 months of massive financial aid to companies.
Whatever it costs was the French government's motto during the pandemic, but ministers and business groups now agree that as the economy recovers, it's time for that to end. Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire told the MEDEF conference that in a plan due to be unveiled next week, financial help will only continue for those businesses who are still suffering losses because of COVID-19 restrictions, with particular attention being paid to sectors like culture, hospitality and tourism. On the issue of labour shortages being suffered by many businesses, Bruno Le Maire says that reform of France's unemployment benefits does need to go ahead on October 1st. He says that needs to be coupled with increased investment in training, but also that there will be need for higher salaries in certain sectors as well to attract staff. What the minister didn't unveil was details of the French government's new investment plan. That's something that's eagerly awaited by business groups too. Now, this event is often somewhat of a beauty pageant for potential future presidents. Although many of them are attending this event, none of the prospective candidates have been invited to lay out their plans to the assembled entrepreneurs. If they're listening, they'll hear the usual calls for reform of the pension system, reform of social welfare, no tax increases, except calls for a carbon border tax, which businesses say that they'll need to compete fairly as they try to reduce their carbon footprint.
Now, if you're old enough to remember CD and record covers, you may remember the iconic photo of a naked baby boy swimming towards a dollar bill from Nirvana's 1991 album, Nevermind. Well, we're not showing that photo because the man who says he was that naked baby has filed a lawsuit against the band for child sexual exploitation. Now 30 years old, the plaintiff, Spencer Eldon, says he suffered lifelong damages from that image. He's seeking $150,000 in compensation from each of several defendants, including Universal Music, the widow of lead singer Kurt Cobain, and surviving members of the band. Nevermind is one of the best-selling albums of all time, having sold over 30 million copies worldwide. You do remember that, don't you?
Yes, I'm definitely old enough to remember that one, and I had a copy of that album. Probably still do somewhere. Thank you very much indeed. Yuka Roya from our business desk. Thanks for bringing us up to speed. I'll be back in a couple of minutes with all the top stories. Don't go away.